There was a time when Christmas didn't begin with store-bought trays or supermarket tins. It began with a dog-eared copy of Mom's or Grandma's favorite Christmas cookie cookbook, fanned open to the pages stained with vanilla, butter, and red food coloring. You'd hear the mixer humming while the radio played Bing Crosby. But then, convenience won out. Today, we're opening those cherished cookbooks back to the pages that once felt like Christmas itself, to remember 25 forgotten cookies that shaped our holidays more than we ever realized. Candy cane cookies. These were the cookies that made every kitchen feel like Santa's workshop. The red and white dough ropes laid out across the counter like tiny stripes waiting to be braided. Betty Crocker printed this recipe in the 1950s cookie book, and it became a December tradition overnight. You had to make 2 batches of dough, one plain and one tinted with red food coloring, and every child in the house begged to help twist the ropes together. The dough smelled like butter, almond extract, and just a hint of peppermint, a combination so tied to Christmas that it could have been bottled as a holiday perfume. Once shaped into little candy canes, they were brushed with a light glaze and sprinkled with crushed peppermint that sparkled under the kitchen light. Families lined them up on the baking sheet as carefully as ornaments, and the whole house filled with the scent of butter and mint. These cookies weren't just treats. They were a quiet lesson in patience, because twisting each cane took time, and the dough softened fast in warm hands. By the time they cooled on wax paper, they looked so cheerful and festive that no one cared if a few were bent or lopsided. They faded from holiday tables when store-bought candy cane desserts became the easier choice. But anyone who remembers shaping these by hand knows they carried the true rhythm of a mid-century Christmas. Starlight Mint Surprise Cookies. Starlight Mint Surprise Cookies originate from Pillsbury's very first Grand National Recipe and Baking Contest, later called the Bake Off, in 1949, where they won second prize. This was the cookie every aunt brought to the church Christmas pageant, always wrapped in a wax paper-lined tin that smelled like chocolate, peppermint, and a little hint of whatever perfume she wore to work. They became a holiday sensation because of one trick: hiding a peppermint chocolate candy inside the dough. When they baked, the outside turned into a soft sugar cookie shell, while the inside melted into a gooey little pool of chocolate mint that tasted like a Christmas stocking in cookie form. Kids always hovered around the cooling rack, waiting for the moment the aunt who made them would say, "Go on, they're cool enough." These cookies felt like small gifts you didn't have to unwrap, and everyone loved the surprise in the center. They began to fade when the original mint candies stopped being sold in many grocery stores, and the recipe slowly slipped from the newer editions of holiday cookbooks. But for anyone who remembers biting into that warm, minty center, these cookies carried the kind of excitement only Christmas baking could bring. Cherry Blinks. Cherry Blinks were the glamorous cousin of the ordinary cookie, the one that showed up wearing a bright red candied cherry like jewelry. Betty Crocker championed this recipe in the 1960s, and every holiday bake-off seemed to have at least one plate of them displayed on a crocheted doily. The dough was soft and lightly spiced, rolled in crushed cornflakes that toasted into a golden, delicate crunch in the oven. A single red cherry half gleamed from the center, catching the Christmas lights like a tiny glass ornament. You could always tell when someone was making these because the smell of vanilla and cornflakes drifted through the whole house. They were the kind of cookie your grandmother put on the good platter, the one she only used for company and Christmas. Over time, candied cherries fell out of fashion, and cereal-coated cookies disappeared with them. But these festive little rounds once had a place on nearly every holiday table, reminding us that even simple ingredients could feel special with the right touch. Swedish cream cookies. These delicate sandwich cookies came from the international pages of mid-century Betty Crocker cookbooks, back when homemakers loved adding a cosmopolitan twist to their holiday spreads. They were made from thin, tender vanilla wafers that practically melted when you held them too long, paired with a whipped, lightly sweetened cream filling. The cookies baked up pale and elegant, the kind of treat you'd expect to find on a silver tray beside a set of holiday china that only came out once a year. They tasted like a cross between shortbread and cloud frosting, airy, buttery, and gone in 2 bites. Families loved them because they felt fancy without being fussy, and every child tried to sneak one before the filling had fully set. Over time, though, anything requiring refrigeration lost ground to pantry-stable treats, and these vanished from most Christmas gatherings. But for anyone who remembers helping assemble them in the quiet afternoon before the relatives arrived, these cookies felt like a small act of holiday elegance, soft, dainty, and full of old-world charm. Bonbon Cookies. These cookies were the treasure hunt of every Betty Crocker Christmas. Smooth dough balls dipped in pastel icing, each hiding a secret center. Sometimes it was a maraschino cherry, sometimes a chocolate drop, sometimes a tiny nut cluster. Grandma improvised because she didn't want to run back out to the store. The dough baked into a tender shell that held its shape, so nobody knew what they were getting until they took that first bite. They were bright, glossy, and irresistible on a cookie platter, looking like tiny Christmas ornaments plucked right off the tree. You'd often find a batch cooling on wax paper beside a bowl of thick icing tinted with red or green food coloring, and kids loved swirling the tops to make their own patterns. These cookies faded as candy-stuffed treats became more commercial, but they once represented the creativity of holiday baking. A little mystery, a little color, and a whole lot of Christmas spirit wrapped up in a single bite. Anyone who remembers these knows they made the dessert table feel like an adventure. Date Pinwheel Cookies. Date Pinwheel cookies are an American icebox or refrigerator cookie that emerged in the early 20th century, becoming especially popular in home kitchens by the 1930s and 1940s. These cookies were the quiet workhorses of Christmas baking. The kind Grandma made a day ahead because the dough needed chilling, and she believed anything that required rest was a sign of good character. The base was a buttery brown sugar dough rolled out into a rectangle, then spread with a thick swirl of homemade date filling cooked down with sugar and a little orange zest. The smell alone was unmistakable. Warm dates bubbling in a saucepan, the sweetness drifting through the house like a hint of fruitcake without the fuss. Once the roll was chilled and sliced, the pinwheels baked into tight little spirals that looked like they belonged in a vintage holiday magazine spread. These were the cookies you'd find on the grown-up platter, the ones set a little higher on the table so kids had to ask permission. They tasted old-fashioned in the best way. Caramelized edges, soft centers, and that deep, almost candy-like date filling that felt like a Christmas tradition all its own. They vanished when fewer families cooked with dates, and the recipe fell to the bottom of the box. But for anyone who remembers slicing the chilled rolls and watching the spirals emerge, these cookies hold the memory of slow winter afternoons, quiet kitchens, and the comfort of a holiday recipe that took its time. Snowball Cookies. Snowball cookies are part of a very old nut and butter cookie tradition that likely began in medieval Arab baking, later spread through Europe, and eventually became known in the U.S. under names like Russian tea cakes and Mexican wedding cookies. Every mid-century Christmas seemed to include at least one plate of Snowball cookies. Dusted so heavily with powdered sugar, they left a trail across the dining table like fresh December frost. Betty Crocker's versions from the 1950s and 60s always called for finely chopped nuts, pecans or walnuts, folded into a simple butter-rich dough that baked into tender, crumbly rounds. These were the cookies that melted before you even finished chewing, leaving that whisper of vanilla and nuttiness behind. Kids loved them because they felt messy and forbidden. Grown-ups loved them because they paired perfectly with afternoon coffee while the turkey was still roasting. You could always tell when a batch was cooling because someone would sneeze, sending a puff of powdered sugar into the air like a tiny indoor snowstorm. They disappeared only because bakeries and supermarket tins started offering their own versions, but none ever tasted like the homemade ones that came straight off a worn recipe card. Holiday Fruit Bars. Holiday fruit bars are a modern, simplified offshoot of old-world fruitcakes and fruit breads, adapted into pan bars for busy American home bakers in the 1950s to 1970s. Rustic, chewy bars loaded with candied cherries, chopped dates, and walnuts bound together with a spiced brown sugar batter that filled the kitchen with the scent of December. They baked into dense, glistening squares that looked like fruitcake's more approachable cousin, and every church potluck had at least one mom who swore by them. Cutting them required a steady hand and a buttered knife, because the sticky fruit clung to everything in sight. But once they cooled, they were irresistible. Chewy on the inside, lightly crisp at the edges, with pops of tart cherry shining through. They vanished when candied fruit dropped off shopping lists, and home bakers shifted toward quicker, softer treats. But one bite of these bars brings back memories of wax paper-lined tins, church basement dessert tables, and the kind of holiday baking that used what the pantry already had: Almond Crescents. Almond Crescents trace back to Central Europe, especially Austria, as part of the broader family of crescent-shaped cookies known as vanilla Kipferl. They were the cookies that felt almost too elegant for a busy December kitchen. Light, delicate curves dusted in a snowy blanket of powdered sugar. The dough was simple but fragrant: ground almonds, cold butter, and just enough flour to hold everything together. As they baked, the house filled with a warm, nutty aroma that hinted at marzipan without being overly sweet. The trick was shaping them into perfect little half-moons, which always made them feel more special than their humble ingredients suggested. Once cooled and dusted, they looked like something plucked from a bakery window on a snowy street. These cookies faded as almond grinding fell out of everyday baking, and store-bought varieties crowded the holiday aisle. Spritz Cookies. These were the cookies that separated the patient baker from the hurried one, because the Spritz press had a mind of its own. Betty Crocker's Spritz Cookies came in cheerful Christmas shapes: stars, trees, wreaths, and relied on a soft, buttery dough that squeezed through a metal press with a satisfying click. The cookies baked up crisp and lightly golden, ready for a shower of red and green sugar that clung to every ridge. Kids loved operating the cookie press like it was a toy, but half the time, the dough refused to stick to the sheet, leading to a chorus of gentle holiday frustration. Still, once the trays came out of the oven, the payoff was undeniable: tiny, perfectly shaped cookies that looked like they walked straight out of a 1950s magazine. They were the pride of many a homemaker who mastered the press, and the official starter cookie for generations of children eager to help. These cookies slowly disappeared as fewer families kept a Spritz gun in the drawer, but they once defined mid-century holiday baking. Peanut butter blossoms. Originally called peanut blossoms, these cookies were the star of the 1957 Pillsbury Cook-Off cookbook, the kind that made kids run to the kitchen the minute they heard the crinkle of a Hershey's Kiss wrapper. The dough was simple: peanut butter, brown sugar, and just enough shortening to give that soft, nostalgic chew. But the real magic happened the second the cookies came out of the oven. Grandma would press a shiny chocolate kiss into the warm center, and you could watch it soften just enough to look like it was melting into the cookie like a tiny Christmas miracle. These were the cookies every school classroom seemed to have on a paper plate covered in plastic wrap during the class party. They tasted like comfort: warm peanut butter, soft centers, and a chocolate top that stuck to your fingers if you didn't wait long enough. Kids loved them because they felt like two treats in one, and grown-ups loved them because they always disappeared from the platter first. They faded only because holiday baking shifted toward pre-boxed mixes and cookie swaps stocked with fancier options. Lebkuchen. Lebkuchen has ancient roots in the honey cake baked by Egyptians thousands of years ago as a gift to the gods. However, Lebkuchen as we know it today was first created by Franconian monks in the 13th century in the region now known as Bavaria. Soft, spicy cookies filled with honey, cinnamon, cloves, and chopped nuts, glazed with a thin layer of icing that set into a shiny winter sheen. The batter smelled like a German Christmas market long before anyone knew what that was: warm spice, dark honey, and a citrus note from grated orange peel. They baked into dense squares that were more cake than cookie, and every bite felt like stepping into a tradition older than the cookbook itself. Families who made these often did so for sentimental reasons: a grandmother from the Midwest who remembered her parents baking them, or a mother who clipped the recipe because she wanted something different for the church Christmas buffet. Cutting them into neat squares was always a challenge because the glaze liked to crack in unpredictable lines, but the flavor made up for every imperfect edge. These gradually disappeared when bakers leaned toward lighter, simpler cookies, and spices became associated more with pumpkin pie than Christmas bars. But anyone who remembers these knows they tasted like heritage. Warmly spiced, honey-sweet, and wrapped in memory. Ribbon cookies. Ribbon cookies don't have a single, well-documented inventor, but the style most people know today grew out of mid-20th century American and Northern European Christmas baking, especially Swedish and Italian-American traditions. They were one of the prettiest holiday showpieces, 3 thin layers of dough, each tinted a different color, stacked and chilled before being sliced into perfect little stripes. They looked like miniature Christmas gifts even before they hit the oven. Homemakers loved them because they offered a burst of color without any frosting or extra fuss. The dough was lightly flavored with almond or vanilla, producing a soft, buttery slice that tasted far simpler than it looked. The real ritual was assembling the layers, rolling each one carefully, stacking them like a pastel Neapolitan, then wrapping the whole block in wax paper to chill overnight. Slicing the roll the next day felt like a reveal. Clean stripes, neat edges, and cookies that looked like they belonged on the front of a holiday card. They faded because they required both patience and refrigerator space, 2 things in short supply once modern life took over. But for anyone who remembers waking up to that chilled block waiting to be sliced, ribbon cookies felt like a small celebration of color, craft, and the quiet preparations that made Christmas special. Molasses Crinkles. Molasses Crinkles were the deep winter soul of Betty Crocker's holiday baking. Dark, fragrant cookies rolled in sugar and baked until their tops split into those beautiful frosty cracks that looked like tiny frozen ponds. The dough was a rich mix of molasses, brown sugar, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, giving the kitchen a warm, old-fashioned aroma that wrapped around you like a wool shawl. You could always tell when someone was making these because the scent drifted through every corner of the house, settling into the curtains and making the whole place feel like December had finally arrived. The rolled sugar coating caramelized in the oven, forming a crisp shell around the soft, chewy center. A perfect contrast Betty Crocker praised in her early Christmas booklets. These cookies were often made in the late afternoon, when the sun was already gone and the kitchen lights glowed golden against the dark windows. They paired perfectly with hot tea, cocoa, or even a little cup of coffee someone wasn't supposed to be drinking after dinner. Over the years, molasses cookies faded as holiday flavors shifted toward peppermint and chocolate. But these old crinkles carried a deeper warmth, the kind of cookie that felt like the quiet heartbeat of Christmas. Anyone who remembers them knows they tasted like winter evenings, old spice tins, and the comfort of a recipe that had been handed down long before the holidays became hurried. Noel Nut Balls. These were the cookies that made even the simplest holiday table feel like a winter tea party. Tiny, buttery rounds rolled in powdered sugar and packed with finely chopped nuts. Betty Crocker often called them Noel Nut Balls or Snowdrop Cookies depending on the year, but every version tasted like the same delicate tradition. The dough was barely sweet, letting the richness of butter and nuts shine through, a flavor profile that felt almost European compared to the American candy-sweet cookies on the table. They baked into tender spheres that crumbled the moment you bit into them, leaving a soft dust of powdered sugar across your lap. These were the cookies that always sat beside the coffee pot during Christmas Eve board games or long conversations after church. They disappeared slowly as people leaned toward brighter, flashier cookies with frosting and sprinkles. But for anyone who remembers scooping these into old metal tins lined with wax paper, Noel Nut Balls tasted like quiet winter evenings. Chocolate refrigerator slices. These were the quiet sleeper hit of mid-century Betty Crocker holiday baking. The cookies every efficient homemaker loved because you could make the dough days ahead, chill it in a wax paper log, and slice off rounds whenever company popped by. The dough itself was rich with cocoa and brown sugar, giving it a deep, almost fudge-like aroma that filled the kitchen even before the oven warmed. Most families added chopped nuts or bits of candied cherries, not because the recipe required it, but because that's what was left in the pantry after the fruitcake was finished. The kind of cookie that never stole the spotlight, but quietly made every holiday gathering feel complete. They disappeared when slice and bake tubes from the grocery store replaced homemade refrigerator cookies, slowly pushing the old wax paper rolls into history. But anyone who remembers cutting into a chilled log on Christmas Eve knows these cookies carried the feeling of being prepared, organized, and just a little bit proud of a dessert that waited patiently for its moment. Orange Gumdrop Cookies. These cookies were the brightest little surprises on a Betty Crocker holiday platter. Soft sugar cookie rounds studded with chopped orange gumdrops that melted into jewel-like pockets as they baked. You could always hear the snip-snip of kitchen scissors as Grandma cut the gumdrops into tiny cubes, dusting each piece in flour so they wouldn't clump together. The dough smelled like orange zest and vanilla, a scent that traveled through the house the moment the mixing bowl came out. When the trays emerged from the oven, the gumdrops glowed through the tops like stained glass windows, catching the light in a way no frosting ever could. Kids loved picking out the pieces with the most orange sparkle, and adults appreciated how chewy and nostalgic each bite felt. These cookies appeared regularly in mid-century holiday pamphlets because they stretched a single bag of candy into several dozen treats. A quiet practicality Betty Crocker understood well. They faded as gumdrops disappeared from many grocery store candy aisles, and families drifted towards simpler, chocolate-heavy cookies. But anyone who remembers these knows they brought a pop of color and cheer to the Christmas table, turning even an ordinary afternoon of baking into something bright and joyful. Butterscotch Drops. These were the sleepers of the Betty Crocker holiday lineup, simple, unassuming cookies that always tasted better than they looked. The dough was a buttery brown sugar base enriched with melted butterscotch chips, turning it into a glossy, caramel-colored batter that filled the kitchen with a warm, candy shop aroma. These cookies baked into soft, slightly chewy mounds with darkened edges and a deep molasses caramel flavor that felt like a cousin to pecan pie filling. Families loved them because they required no decorations, no frosting, no sprinkles. Just the scent alone made them feel festive. You'd often find a batch cooling beside the stovetop where someone was stirring hot chocolate, and the combination of cocoa and warm butterscotch was pure December comfort. They faded when butterscotch fell out of fashion, and holiday cookies skewed heavily toward peppermint and chocolate. Peppermint Shortbread Rounds. Peppermint shortbread rounds were Betty Crocker's way of adding elegance to Christmas baking without a lot of fuss. The dough was simple: flour, sugar, butter, and a touch of peppermint extract, but it baked into crisp, delicate rounds that felt like something you'd serve with hot tea in front of the Christmas tree. The magic was in the edges, rolled in crushed candied peppermint so each slice sparkled with little red and white flecks. When the cookies baked, the peppermint melted slightly, leaving a ribbon of glossy candy around the perimeter that caught the candlelight like frosted glass. They snapped cleanly when you bit into them, giving way to a cool, buttery flavor that lingered just long enough to feel festive. These were the cookies you'd find stacked neatly in old tin boxes lined with parchment, often tied with a red satin bow for gifting. They disappeared as shortbread became something people bought instead of made, and peppermint desserts shifted toward barks and brownies. But for those who remember shaping the logs and coating them in crushed candy, these cookies carried the quiet charm of a Christmas afternoon steeped in tradition. Spiced Oatmeal Christmas Cookies. These hearty, aromatic cookies were the soul warmers of Betty Crocker's December baking, a comforting blend of oats, cinnamon, nutmeg, and brown sugar that made the whole house smell like a holiday candle before holiday candles were a thing. They weren't flashy, but they had staying power, chewy centers, crisp edges, and the kind of spice profile that felt like it belonged beside the tree during a snowy evening. Many families added extras depending on what was in the pantry: raisins, chopped dates, walnuts, or bits of candied orange peel saved from fruitcake prep. The dough mixed up quickly, needing no chilling or shaping fuss, which made them a favorite for busy mothers, trying to bake between school concerts and wrapping presents. They appeared often in the 1960s and 70s Betty Crocker Christmas guides because they stretched ingredients and kept well in tins. Over the years, oatmeal cookies lost their holiday identity and became an everyday staple, pushing out these spiced December versions. But anyone who remembers the warm spice drifting from the oven on a cold afternoon knows these cookies were the quiet comfort of the season. Frosted Maple Pecan Cookies. These cookies tasted like the cozy side of winter, the part with wool sweaters, glowing lamps, and a pot of coffee warming on the stove while the house filled with holiday chatter. Betty Crocker published versions of these in her late 1950s and early 60s Christmas booklets, always emphasizing that maple flavoring gave old-fashioned charm to a modern cookie. The dough baked into soft, nutty rounds dotted with chopped pecans, but the star was the maple frosting, a warm, glossy glaze made from powdered sugar, and real or imitation maple flavor, depending on what the pantry held. When spread over the warm cookies, the icing set into a satiny finish that caught the light like fresh ice on a tree branch. These were the cookies adults gravitated toward, especially the aunts who claimed they weren't eating sweets, but somehow managed 3 of these before dinner. They faded when maple extract became less common in home pantries and pecans grew pricier. But anyone who remembers these knows they tasted like the kind of winter comfort women created long before scented candles. Peppermint Meringue Puffs. These were the feather-light beauties of the Betty Crocker holiday lineup. Airy, pastel-tinted meringues that melted the moment they touched your tongue. They looked delicate enough to belong in a department store window display, yet they came from the humblest mid-century kitchens armed with nothing more than egg whites, sugar, and a bottle of peppermint extract. Every homemaker who made these remembers the sound of the mixer whirring for what felt like ages, slowly transforming glossy egg whites into stiff, cloud-like peaks. A few drops of red food coloring swirled through the bowl, turned them into soft pink puffs that felt tailor-made for December. Betty Crocker recommended piping them into little spirals on brown baking parchment. And once they cooled, they had that crisp outside, marshmallow soft inside texture that made them feel like Christmas magic. Kids loved popping them like candy, while adults treated them like a delicate indulgence with late evening coffee after the wrapping was finally done. These disappeared partly because meringues require patience and a dry winter day, 2 things modern home bakers don't always have. But anyone who remembers lifting these weightless cookies from a parchment sheet knows they carried a little whimsy, airy, peppermint-kissed, and gone before the cookie tray even made it to the living room. Cinnamon Jumbles. Cinnamon Jumbles were one of Betty Crocker's earliest holiday cookies. Soft, cakey rounds flavored with brown sugar, cinnamon, and a hint of nutmeg. They belong to the generation of old-style cookies homemakers made before Christmas, baking turned colorful and decorative. These baked up puffy and tender, almost like miniature spice cakes, and their warm, comforting scent filled the kitchen long before the oven timer rang. Some families frosted them with a thin vanilla glaze. Others sprinkled a modest dusting of cinnamon sugar that melted into the surface. They tasted like December mornings before the house woke up, gentle, warm, and quietly festive. These jumbles fell out of fashion once cookies became more about appearance than aroma, but for decades they were the holiday backbone of homes that valued flavor over flair. Anyone who remembers these knows they weren't showstoppers. They were soul soothers, the kind of cookie people reached for when the snow was coming down and the world felt hushed. Pinwheel refrigerator cookies. These cookies were the showpieces of mid-century kitchen organization. The kind of treat every efficient homemaker loved because she could prepare the dough days in advance and slice off perfect spirals when company arrived. Betty Crocker showcased them in nearly every holiday edition because they photographed beautifully, tight chocolate and vanilla swirls that looked like cheerful little targets on a serving platter. Making them required patience, rolling 2 doughs into identical rectangles, stacking them just so, and then coaxing them into a neat, firm log wrapped in wax paper. Once chilled, they sliced like butter, revealing clean, crisp spirals that baked into lightly sweet cookies with just a hint of cocoa. Kids loved them because the pattern felt like something from a candy store, and adults admired how tidy and uniform they looked on a Christmas tray. These disappeared when slice and bake supermarket logs became the norm, but they once represented the graceful side of holiday prep: quiet planning, overnight chilling, and the satisfying click of a knife slicing through cold dough on a busy December morning. Holly Wreath Cookies. These were the most whimsical cookies Betty Crocker ever encouraged homemakers to make. Bright, green, marshmallow-coated cornflake wreaths decorated with red cinnamon candies. They weren't baked at all. Instead, they came together on the stovetop, where marshmallows melted with butter and green food coloring before being stirred into a bowl of crunchy cereal. Forming them was a family activity. Everyone buttered their fingers and shaped warm handfuls into little wreaths, adding 3 tiny cinnamon berries for decoration. They looked like miniature Christmas crafts rather than cookies, and the sticky, sweet smell filled the whole kitchen. Kids adored them because they felt like edible decorations, and adults liked that they required no oven space during the busiest baking week of the year. These cookies faded as food dyes fell out of favor, and cornflake treats drifted into the nostalgia category. But for anyone who remembers shaping them at the kitchen table, Holly Wreath Cookies brought a sense of playful holiday spirit, the kind of hands-on, family-made magic that defined so many mid-century Christmas seasons. As we look back at these 25 forgotten Christmas cookies, it's hard not to feel the echo of the kitchens they came from. The mixing bowls that lived under the sink, the ovens that never quite heated evenly, and the families who gathered around card tables covered in wax paper and good intentions. These weren't just recipes. They were small December traditions that stitched themselves into our memories long before we knew what nostalgia was. Every cookie carried a moment. A grandmother teaching you how to twist candy cane dough without breaking it. An aunt proudly arriving with her tin of Spritz stars. A mother standing over the counter late at night finishing one last batch because she wanted Christmas morning to feel special. These cookies disappeared from our holiday tables, but the feeling they created never truly left. It lingers in the smell of vanilla, the sound of a mixer, the way a kitchen warms up on a cold night. So as you head into this season, maybe one of these recipes will find its way back into your home. Not to recreate the past, but to bring forward the small joys that made those Christmases feel so full. The laughter, the patience, the love, and the simple magic of a homemade cookie cooling on a wire rack. And thanks for spending a little time in the memories with me. Wishing you a warm, sweet, and meaningful holiday season.